Some cartoons are built loosely enough that the holes inside them are easy to count. SpongeBob SquarePants is one of those cartoons. A sea sponge is born from an egg in one episode and from a hospital delivery in another. His first words are a customer service phrase. His first words are also the name of a hamburger. A starfish has no sister, then has a sister twice his size, then has a different sister who is a squid. A grumpy octopus has worked at the same restaurant for 17 years, even though he was already exhausted by his job on the day the show began. A city forgets Christmas after singing about it for a whole season. A frozen octopus travels 2,000 years into the future and accidentally invents the sport his neighbors have been playing their whole lives. Tonight, we walk through every major timeline error in the show and the theories that finally make them fit. Welcome to Cartoonology. Let's get started. The sliding year, the floating sponge, and why SpongeBob has no age. The first timeline error in SpongeBob SquarePants is not a contradiction between two episodes. It is a contradiction between the show and the calendar on the wall of the people watching it. The series premiered on May 1st, 1999. The pilot episode was Help Wanted. The character SpongeBob SquarePants showed up that night as a fully formed adult, with his own house, his own pet snail, his own best friend in the rock next door, and a very specific lifelong dream of working at the Krusty Krab. He was old enough to live alone. He was old enough to apply for a job. He was old enough to attend boating school as an adult, which was the compromise Steven Hillenburg had reached with Nickelodeon when the network insisted that the main character had to go to school. SpongeBob, on the night the show premiered, was an adult. 2 seasons later, on a Tuesday in early 2001, Nickelodeon aired an episode called Sleepy Time. The plot of the episode is small. SpongeBob has a series of dreams about driving the boatmobile he is not yet allowed to drive, and at one point in those dreams, the camera lingers on a piece of paper inside his pocket. The piece of paper is his driver's license. The license is laid out exactly the way a real American driver's license is laid out, with a photograph in the corner, a name written across the top, and a row of dates and addresses underneath. One of those dates is the date of birth. The date of birth printed on SpongeBob's license is July 14th, 1986. The same license is shown again in the Season 2 episode No Free Rides, which aired on May 4th, 2002. The birth date is the same, July 14th, 1986. The number was placed there twice, on screen, in 2 different episodes, by the people who made the show. It was not a typo. It was a deliberate animation choice that 2 separate production teams approved. The implication of that birth date, if anyone takes it seriously, is mathematical. A person born on July 14th, 1986 would have been 12 years old when the show first aired in May 1999. SpongeBob, on the night of his television debut, was a child. By 2010, he would have been 24. By 2020, he would have been 34. By the time the show celebrated its 25th anniversary, the SpongeBob shown in the Sleepy Time license would have been 38 years old, which is older than the actor Tom Kenny was when he first auditioned for the role. None of these numbers fit anything the show has ever depicted. SpongeBob has never aged on screen. The character on the license has been 12, then 20, then 30, then 38, all while looking exactly the same and acting exactly the same. The show, sensing the problem, has been quietly walking the date back since the moment it was first printed. Every appearance of SpongeBob's driver's license after No Free Rides has removed the birth date from the layout entirely. The license still appears. It still has a photograph, a name, an address, and an expiration date. The line where the date of birth used to sit is empty. According to a May 2009 issue of a Turkish SpongeBob SquarePants magazine, an attempt was made to retroactively explain the original date by claiming that SpongeBob had only seen the license inside a dream, which would mean the birth date was a dream detail and not real. The Turkish magazine explanation contradicts the canon of No Free Rides, which shows the license functioning in waking life. The official answer, by 2010, was that there was no official answer. Patrick's driver's license, in the few episodes where it has been visible, has never had a birth date on it. Mr. Whatzit Tuya, a recurring background character, has a license without a birth date. The writers and animators, after the experience of being held to the 1986 number for almost a decade, decided to simply stop putting birth dates on character licenses. The number that had been placed on screen as a small joke had become a problem they could not unwrite, and the only way out was to leave the field blank from then on. Steven Hillenburg, asked directly about SpongeBob's age in interviews, would never confirm a number. He once joked that SpongeBob was 50 in sponge years, which is a comedic answer that nobody can verify, since the average lifespan lifespan of a real yellow tube sponge is just over 100 years, and there is no agreed-upon conversion rate between sponge time and human time. The joke was a way of avoiding the question. The serious answer Hillenburg gave, when pressed, was that SpongeBob did not have a specific age, but that he was old enough to be on his own and still be going to driving school. The phrasing was deliberate. Old enough to be on his own. The phrasing rules out a child. Old enough to still be going to driving school. The phrasing rules out a fully grown adult who should already have a license. SpongeBob was, in Hillenburg's framing, somewhere in the gap between those two states, and the gap was where the character lived permanently. Hillenburg's resistance to giving SpongeBob an age was a direct extension of a larger principle that animators have been using for almost as long as animation itself has existed. The principle is called the floating timeline, and the formal definition of it appears across the animation and comics industries in a way that suggests everyone in the field already understood it long before anyone bothered to write it down. A floating timeline is a setting in which characters age little or not at all, while the world around them keeps moving forward in a way that stays roughly contemporary to the audience watching. Time, inside a floating timeline, exists for the world. Time does not exist for the people who live in the world. The Simpson family has been around the same age since 1989. Mickey Mouse has been the same age since the 1920s. Garfield has been the same age, the same weight, and the same grumpy attitude since 1978. SpongeBob, by joining this tradition, was simply choosing a strategy that almost every long-running animated show has chosen at some point. The reason cartoons use this strategy is partly creative and partly commercial. The creative reason is that aging characters lock writers into stories about aging, and aging stories tend to end. A character who turns 80 will eventually have to deal with retirement, illness, or death, and most children's cartoons are not built for those subjects. A character who stays the same age can have 10,000 adventures in any order, and every adventure can be the audience's first. The commercial reason is that a frozen character can be sold as merchandise indefinitely. SpongeBob plush dolls produced in 2001 still look exactly like the SpongeBob plush dolls produced in 2025. The brand stays stable, the character stays sellable. Hillenburg, who hated the merchandising of the show, would have had mixed feelings about that second reason, but the creative reason was already enough on its own to justify the choice. The result, inside SpongeBob, is that time behaves in a way that nobody on the production side ever sat down and explained. Episodes are dated by their air date in the real world, but are not dated inside the show itself. The Krusty Krab does not have a calendar on the wall. The boating school does not have a class roster with a year on it. SpongeBob does not have a birthday cake with the number printed on top. Birthdays are celebrated 4 times across the series. In the episodes I Had an Accident, SpongeBob Meets the Strangler, Waiting, and SpongeBob's Big Birthday Blowout. And not one of those 4 episodes ever specifies which birthday is being celebrated. The cake never has a number on it. The candles are never counted. SpongeBob's Big Birthday Blowout, which aired on July 12, 2019, came the closest to a confirmation of his age. The script was written so that SpongeBob would nearly say his number out loud at the end of the episode, and then, in the actual cut, the line is interrupted by the closing of the show before the number can be spoken. The interruption is not an accident. The writers built the moment specifically so the number would never be heard. The same principle applies to almost every other character in the show. Patrick has no confirmed age. Squidward has no confirmed age, beyond the fact that he is older than SpongeBob and Patrick and is sometimes referred to in passing as Old Man Squidward, which is more of a verbal jab than a numerical claim. Mr. Krabs has the November 30th, 1942 birth date confirmed in the SpongeBob SquarePants Trading Cards Premiere Edition, which would make him 83 years old in 2026. But he does not look or behave like an 83-year-old, and his stamina, his mobility, and his daily fry cook supervision suggest the show is not really committing to that number either. Plankton, born the same day as Mr. Krabs, has the same problem. Sandy is from Texas and is sometimes referenced as a young woman, but no specific age has ever been given for her either. The entire main cast is, by deliberate choice, locked into a soft, undefined adulthood that the show refuses to pin down. The floating timeline also explains why the technology in Bikini Bottom keeps changing without anyone noticing. The early seasons of the show, from 1999 through about 2004, depict a world that uses landline telephones, single-bulb televisions, televisions, paper newspapers delivered to doorsteps, and a very minimal level of computer technology. The mid-period seasons begin introducing flat-screen monitors, more complex versions of Karen the supercomputer, and the kind of small electronic conveniences that the real world had developed by that point. The later seasons, from about 2017 onward, openly include smartphones, social media, and a level of internet integration that would have been impossible to depict in 1999. The technology in the world keeps drifting forward in line with the real world. The characters using the technology never drift forward. SpongeBob holds a flip phone in one episode and a smartphone in the next, and his hand is the same hand. His age is the same age. His house is the same house. The world is changing around him, and he is exactly where he was the day he first arrived at the Krusty Krab. That is the foundation of every timeline error the show has ever produced, and it is the reason no fan attempt to build a proper continuity for the series has ever succeeded. The series was built from the beginning on the assumption that time inside Bikini Bottom was not going to be tracked. Hillenburg made that decision in 1997. The decision held through every season that followed. Every time the show contradicts itself, somewhere underneath that contradiction, the floating timeline is the reason the contradiction was allowed to happen. The writers were not careless. They were working inside a system that had no calendar. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The floating timeline explains why SpongeBob has no fixed age, but it does not explain why two different episodes give two different versions of how he was born. In the next section, we walk through the egg, the pregnancy, the first words, and the fetus who already knew what a Krabby Patty was. Section 2. First words, first days, and the two versions of how SpongeBob was born. The earliest verified moment in SpongeBob SquarePants' life, according to the show, is the moment he said his first words. The information is delivered casually in the pilot episode Help Wanted, which aired on May 1st, 1999. The scene is a back and forth between SpongeBob and Patrick on the way to the Krusty Krab. SpongeBob is panicking. He has decided he is not good enough for the job he has been dreaming about. Patrick, in an attempt to encourage him, asks him a series of questions designed to remind him of how much he was always meant to do this. The first question is the relevant one. Patrick asks SpongeBob whose first words were quote, zero, underscore. SpongeBob answers with full conviction that his were. The exchange is a joke. The joke is that SpongeBob was born ready to work the cash register at a fast food restaurant, and that even as an infant, his first attempt at human language was already shaped by the destiny he was about to spend his entire adult life pursuing. The line establishes something specific in canon. SpongeBob's first words were, "May I take your order?" Not mama, not dada, a complete 5-word sentence delivered as soon as he could speak. 8 years later, on November 6, 2009, Nickelodeon aired the primetime special, SpongeBob's Truth or Square. The special was the show's 10th anniversary celebration. The plot was structured around a series of flashbacks, with SpongeBob, Patrick, Squidward, and Mr. Krabs trapped inside a Krusty Krab freezer and remembering their pasts. One of the flashbacks shows the moment SpongeBob was born. The scene takes place inside a hospital. SpongeBob's mother is shown lying in a hospital bed, visibly pregnant. She is in labor. SpongeBob's father is at her side. There is a doctor in the room. The mother delivers SpongeBob in the way that mammals deliver children. SpongeBob, the moment he is born, opens his mouth and speaks his first words. The words are not, "May I take your order?" The words are, "Krabby Patty." The contradiction inside the Truth or Square flashback is not minor. It is doubled. The first half of the contradiction is the dialogue. SpongeBob's first words, by the canon of Help Wanted, were a customer service phrase. SpongeBob's first words, by the canon of Truth or Square, were the name of a hamburger. The second half of the contradiction is the imagery. SpongeBob, in the flashback, comes out of his mother the way a mammal comes out of its mother. His mother is pregnant. She has a belly. She gives birth in a hospital bed. The flashback is consistent with how a human child is born. 6 years before Truth or Square aired, on February 17th, 2001, the show had aired a different episode that established a completely different version of the same event. The episode is Your Shoes Untied, which is the first segment of the second season's opening episode. The plot is built around SpongeBob trying to remember how to tie his shoes. At one point, he tries to recall how long his shoelaces have been tied. The flashback flashback that accompanies this memory does not show a hospital. It does not show a mother in labor. It shows a live-action photograph of a real-world sea sponge egg, which the animators have filmed and pasted into the cartoon, with two small animated legs attached to the bottom of the egg. The legs are wearing shoes. The shoes have laces. The laces are tied. The implication, delivered without any commentary, is that SpongeBob came into existence as an egg with shoes and laces already on him, and that the laces had been tied since the moment of that egg's existence. Real sea sponges in the actual ocean do reproduce by releasing eggs and sperm into the water column, where the eggs are fertilized externally and develop into free-swimming larvae before settling onto a surface and growing. The "your shoes untied" flashback is, on a marine biology level, the more accurate depiction of how a yellow sea sponge would actually be born. Steven Hillenberg, with his marine biology background, would have known this. The egg flashback was, in 2001, his way of grounding SpongeBob's biology in the species the character was actually based on. The Truth or Square flashback, 8 years later, abandoned that biology entirely. SpongeBob is shown being born from a placental mammal, in a delivery bed, with a doctor present. The choice was made for comedy, because the comedy of a yellow sponge being delivered by a hospital obstetrician is a different, and arguably stronger joke than the comedy of a sponge hatching from an egg. The price of the choice was that the show now contained two separate, mutually exclusive versions of how its main character had been born. The first word's contradiction sits on top of the birth contradiction. If SpongeBob came out of an egg, the question of when he first spoke is open. If SpongeBob came out of a hospital delivery, the question is closed, and the answer depends on which episode is being trusted. Help Wanted says one thing, Truth or Square says another thing. The show has never resolved the conflict, and there is no official tiebreaker. The wikis attempting to track these moments simply note that the discrepancy exists and move on. The contradiction widens further once Truth or Square is examined for its other flashbacks. The same episode shows a moment in which SpongeBob's mother, while still pregnant, walks into the Krusty Krab to order food. SpongeBob, inside her belly, begins kicking with excitement at the smell of the patties. Mr. Krabs, in the flashback, is already operating the restaurant. The implication is that the Krusty Krab existed before SpongeBob was born, that it was already serving Krabby Patties, that Mr. Krabs was already running it, and that SpongeBob's first encounter with the restaurant happened while he was still inside his mother. This part of the flashback also conflicts with the show's earlier canon, because in the season 5 episode Friend or Foe, which aired on April 13th, 2007, the entire history of how the Krabby Patty came into existence is shown, and the timeline of that history involves Mr. Krabs and Plankton being children together, growing up, opening a failed first restaurant in a dump, and only later in life buying the abandoned retirement home that became the Krusty Krab. Squeezing all of that into the available years between Mr. Krabs' 1942 birthday and SpongeBob's prenatal Krusty Krab visit creates a window that is either very wide or very narrow, depending on which other piece of canon the viewer is willing to commit to. The Help Wanted timeline error is the most quietly significant of all of these. In the pilot episode, SpongeBob walks up to the Krusty Krab and announces that he has been training his whole life for this moment. He says he is finally ready to join the Krusty crew. The line treats this as the first day. SpongeBob has never worked there before. He is applying for the job. Squidward, watching him approach, is annoyed, but is already an employee. The Krusty Krab is already operating. Mr. Krabs is already counting his money in his office. The restaurant has been there for some unspecified amount of time before SpongeBob's arrival. The Friend or Foe episode, 6 years later, shows that the Krusty Krab was founded as a refurbished retirement home that Mr. Krabs bought after returning from the war and emerging from his depression. The Krusty Krab training video, which aired on May 10th, 2002, walks the viewer through the same backstory in slightly different language. The restaurant existed long before SpongeBob ever set foot in it. The exact length of __quote _6 _ is the part the show keeps moving around. In the season 9 episode, Goodbye Krabby Patty, which aired on February 20th, 2017, Squidward casually mentions that he has been working at the Krusty Krab for 17 years. The line is a deliberate inside joke about the show's own real-world runtime, since 17 years is roughly the gap between the show's premiere in 1999 and the production of that episode in 2016. But if that line is taken as canon, canon. It places Squidward's hiring at the Krusty Krab in approximately 1999 or 2000, which is roughly the same time SpongeBob was hired, which contradicts every other flashback in the series that shows Squidward as an established Krusty Krab employee long before SpongeBob arrived. SpongeBob, in Help Wanted, also appears to know Squidward's name. He calls Squidward by his name without being introduced. The pilot episode does not pause to explain how SpongeBob knows the cashier of a restaurant he has never worked at. The Truth or Square flashback eventually offers an answer by showing SpongeBob's mother walking him past the Krusty Krab as a small child, and showing SpongeBob looking through the window at Squidward, who is already inside the restaurant in his cashier uniform. The answer is that SpongeBob has been observing Squidward from outside for years. The answer also creates a new problem, because if SpongeBob has been watching the Krusty Krab from outside for years, and Squidward has been working there for years before SpongeBob's hiring, then the 17-year line in Goodbye Krabby Patty cannot be accurate, because Squidward should have been there for much longer than 17 years. The pile of contradictions is real. It is not the result of one or two writers being careless. The pile builds up because the show's writing room, across more than 2 decades, has been adding flashbacks and origin stories without ever consulting the previous flashbacks and origin stories. Every new origin scene is written as if it is the first one, because the writers and the storyboarders for each episode are working on a deadline, and the wiki entry that would have caught the contradiction has not been built yet. By the time the contradiction is noticed, the episode has already aired and the canon has already been broken. Vincent Waller, the current showrunner, has acknowledged in interviews that the show treats continuity loosely on purpose. The looseness is a feature. The cost of the looseness is that the same character can be born twice, in 2 different ways, in 2 different episodes, and the only person who notices is the fan watching at home. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The 2 versions of SpongeBob's birth are the deepest contradiction in the show's earliest canon, but the question of who was already working at the Krusty Krab on the day he arrived is older still. In the next section, we walk through the pineapple that crushed the garden and the 17 years that do not add up. Section 3, the pineapple that crushed the garden and the octopus who was already there. The character of Squidward Tentacles, on the night the show premiered, walked into Help Wanted as a fully established Krusty Krab employee. He was outside the restaurant when SpongeBob arrived. He was cleaning a piece of graffiti off the front window. The graffiti was a drawing of his own face, with the word "7" written above it. The detail is small, but it carries information. Someone in Bikini Bottom had taken the time to draw an insulting cartoon of Squidward's face on the front of the restaurant where he worked. The graffiti was old enough that Squidward had been assigned the task of removing it. He was annoyed. He was bored. He was, by every visible signal, a person who had been working at this exact location, in this exact role, for some non-trivial amount of time before the events of the pilot began. His uniform fit him. His walk was tired. His relationship with Mr. Krabs was already established. His patience for new arrivals was already gone. Squidward, on the night of his television debut, had been at the Krusty Krab long enough to be sick of it. 10 years later, on November 6th, 2009, the same character walked into a flashback inside Truth or Square that contradicted everything the pilot had established about him. The flashback in Truth or Square shows Squidward in a quiet, peaceful moment, standing outside his Easter Island Moai head with a watering can, gently tending a garden of flowers that he has clearly been cultivating for some time. The garden is full, the flowers are healthy, the neighborhood is calm. There is no SpongeBob, there is no pineapple. The narration of the flashback is delivered by Squidward himself, who is recalling the days of his life before SpongeBob moved in next door. He describes the period as happy. He describes himself as content. The implication is that Squidward, before the events of the show, had a life that he genuinely enjoyed. The flashback then shows the moment that life ended. A boat is shown moving across the ocean far above. A pineapple is sitting on the deck of the boat. The pineapple, for a reason the show does not explain, falls off the boat. It descends through the water. It lands on Squidward's garden, crushing every flower. The pineapple settles into the wreckage. Within seconds, in the cartoon logic of the flashback, the pineapple has become a house. SpongeBob then walks out of the door of the pineapple, sees Squidward, and introduces himself as the new neighbor. Patrick is shown as already living next door, in his rock, before SpongeBob's arrival, but the flashback does not explain when Patrick moved in either. The Truth or Square flashback rewrites the meeting between Squidward and SpongeBob into a domestic event. SpongeBob, SpongeBob, in this version, is not a man who has been training his whole life to work at the Krusty Krab. He is a new neighbor who has just arrived in the neighborhood. The first contact between him and Squidward happens at the property line. The first contact between him and the Krusty Krab, by the logic of this flashback, has not yet occurred. The two of them have to know each other as neighbors first, and only later become co-workers. The pilot episode does not allow for any of this. In Help Wanted, SpongeBob has been dreaming of the Krusty Krab for years. He has been training. He has been preparing. He arrives at the door of the restaurant for the first time, in his own narration, on the day of the pilot. Squidward, inside the restaurant, recognizes him on sight and is already exhausted by him. The two of them are already neighbors. The pineapple is already on Conch Street. The garden is not mentioned because there is no garden left. Either the flashback in Truth or Square took place years before Help Wanted, with the Krusty Krab somehow operating the entire time without SpongeBob noticing, or the flashback contradicts the pilot's premise that SpongeBob arrived at the restaurant for the first time on the day of the pilot. The contradiction does not stop at the pineapple in the garden. It deepens once Squidward's tenure at the Krusty Krab is examined more carefully. The show has, over its run, given Squidward several different lengths of service that do not match each other. The Season 9 episode, Goodbye Krabby Patty, which aired on February 20th, 2017, contains a casual line in which Squidward mentions that he has been working at the Krusty Krab for 17 years. The line is a deliberate inside joke. The show, at the time the episode was being written and produced in 2016, was approaching its 17th year on the air. The writers slipped the number into Squidward's dialogue as a wink to the audience, acknowledging the gap between the show's debut and the moment of broadcast. The line is intended to be funny. The line is also, technically, a piece of canon because the character is speaking it on screen and no one in the episode contradicts him. 17 years from 2016 places Squidward's hiring at the Krusty Krab around 1999, which is the year the show premiered, which is the year SpongeBob walked into the restaurant for the first time. The math, taken at face value, would suggest that Squidward and SpongeBob were hired at the Krusty Krab in roughly the same period. The pilot episode does not support this. In Help Wanted, Squidward is already an established cashier when SpongeBob arrives. The job is his, the uniform is his, the boredom is his. The graffiti on the window has had time to be drawn by someone, noticed by Mr. Krabs, and assigned to Squidward to clean. The version of events shown in Help Wanted is not the version of events that would result from Squidward being hired in 1999. The Krusty Krab itself, by the canon of multiple later episodes, was founded long before SpongeBob walked through the door. The Krusty Krab training video, which aired on May 10th, 2002, narrates the founding of the restaurant inside the body of an abandoned retirement home that Mr. Krabs bought after returning from his unspecified military service. The Friend or Foe episode, which aired on April 13th, 2007, traces the founding of the Krabby Patty itself back to a fight between a young Mr. Krabs and a young Plankton in a literal dump, long before either of them was old enough to run a fast food restaurant in a respectable part of town. Mr. Krabs and Plankton were both born on November 30th, 1942, according to the SpongeBob SquarePants Trading Cards Premiere Edition, which means they were teenagers in the late 1950s and adults from the 1960s onward. The Krusty Krab, in its current form, has been operating in Bikini Bottom for at least several decades. There is also the matter of Jim. The Krusty Krab training video introduces Jim, the original fry cook, who worked at the restaurant before SpongeBob was hired. Jim invented something called the Jim Patty, which was, according to the training video, briefly more popular than the Krabby Patty. Jim eventually quit because Mr. Krabs underpaid him. The Season 7 episode, The Original Fry Cook, which aired on November 27th, 2009, brings Jim back as a successful and wealthy guest returning to the Krusty Krab to visit. The existence of Jim establishes that there was a fry cook before SpongeBob, and that the timeline of fry cooks at the restaurant is, at minimum, 2 cooks long. There may have been others. The show has never given a complete list. Squidward, in the same Truth or Square flashback that shows SpongeBob arriving as a new neighbor, also recalls a brief period in which the Krusty Krab employed a fry cook named Not SpongeBob. The character was given the placeholder name because Squidward, in his memory, could not be bothered to recall the actual name of the cook. Not SpongeBob is shown as a friendly, optimistic young fish who acted exactly the way the real SpongeBob would later act, and whose presence Squidward found annoying for the same reasons he would later find SpongeBob annoying. The implication of Not SpongeBob's existence difference is that Squidward worked at the Krusty Krab during a period that included an entire other fry cook between Jim and SpongeBob, which means the 17-year line cannot be correct, because 17 years is not enough time to fit Jim, not SpongeBob, and the entire pre-SpongeBob Squidward era into the canon. The simplest explanation for the entire contradiction is that Squidward has been at the Krusty Krab for much longer than 17 years, and that the line in Goodbye Krabby Patty was a comedic, real-world reference rather than a serious canonical statement. The complicated explanation is that the show, by 2017, was no longer attempting to track how long any of its characters had been doing anything. The 17-year reference was funny because the audience knew the show had been on the air for 17 years. The reference also made internal canon worse because it asserted a number that did not match anything else the show had ever shown about Squidward's career. The pilot, by every reasonable reading, takes precedence in this case. Squidward in Help Wanted is a tired, established employee. He has been at the Krusty Krab long enough to feel its weight. The flashback in Truth or Square, which shows him still in his happy gardening era at the moment SpongeBob arrives, is not consistent with the man on screen in 1999. The two depictions cannot both be true. The Goodbye Krabby Patty 17-year line is not consistent with either of them. The show has, on 3 separate occasions across its run, given 3 different answers to the question of how long Squidward has been working at the Krusty Krab, and none of the answers fit. The fan-side attempts to reconcile this have been creative, but unconvincing. One reading of the Truth or Square flashback suggests that Squidward's memory of the garden is not literal, but is a romanticized reconstruction of his pre-SpongeBob life, the way an adult might exaggerate the happiness of a childhood that was actually more complicated. Another reading suggests that the 17-year line was Squidward lying about his tenure to make himself sound more experienced. Neither reading is supported by anything inside the show. The simpler conclusion, accepted by most analysts of the series, is that the show contains 3 different versions of Squidward's history because the show has never decided which version is correct, and the decision is not coming. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Squidward's tenure is a contradiction the show has been carrying for decades, but the contradictions inside Patrick's family are even messier. In the next section, we walk through the sister who never existed, the sister who showed up anyway, and the third sister who arrived years later. Section 4, the sister who was not there, and the sister who was, and the other sister who came after. The Season 2 episode, Something Smells, aired on October 26th, 2001. The plot is one of the simplest the show has ever written. SpongeBob, having eaten a snack made of onions, peanut butter, and ice cream, develops bad breath that he is not aware of. Every character he encounters reacts to the smell with horror, but never explains the smell to him directly. SpongeBob, watching the reactions, concludes that he has somehow become physically ugly and falls into a deep self-pity spiral. Patrick spends most of the episode trying to comfort him without ever recognizing that the problem is breath rather than appearance. In the middle of the episode, SpongeBob and Patrick have a conversation about the nature of ugliness, and Patrick, in a moment of accidental self-reflection, delivers a line that has caused the SpongeBob fan community to pull at its hair for over 20 years. Patrick says that he is worried about what his sister will think if she finds out about SpongeBob's condition. Then, in a beat of hesitation, Patrick corrects himself. He says in the same breath that he forgot he does not have a sister. The line is 1 sentence long. It is not commented on. It is not returned to. It is the kind of small character moment that the show, in 2001, was inserting into episodes to give the characters texture. Patrick, the line establishes, is so confused about the basic facts of his own life that he can briefly believe he has a sister and then correct himself in real time. The joke is that he is forgetful. The unspoken canon, by the logic of the line, is that Patrick is an only child. He has parents, who are eventually shown in later episodes. He has grandparents, who are referenced in passing. He does not have a sister. The show has, in 2001, established this on screen, in dialogue spoken by the character himself, in an episode that has never been pulled from circulation and is still available on every platform that streams SpongeBob. 9 years later, on January 15th, 2011, Nickelodeon aired the Season 7 episode, Big Sister Sam. The plot is, again, simple. Patrick has an older sister named Samantha Starr, who goes by Sam. She is enormous. She is much larger than Patrick. She speaks in incomplete sentences and refers to herself in the third person. She has black hair that she she wears in a side ponytail. Her voice is provided by Bill Fagerbach, who also voices Patrick, and the choice to have Patrick's voice actor also voice his sister was an animation decision rather than a casting one. Sam arrives in Bikini Bottom to visit Patrick. She immediately destroys SpongeBob's house and Squidward's house in fits of rage. She acts, throughout the episode, as a more aggressive and less self-aware version of Patrick himself. The episode does not address the fact that Patrick previously stated on screen that he had no sister. The episode treats Sam's existence as an established fact of Patrick's family that the audience has somehow simply not been informed of yet. Patrick, when SpongeBob asks about Sam, mentions in passing that he lost her in the surf when they were kids. The line is offered as a kind of throwaway explanation, although the show does not commit to it as a real piece of canon either. Sam, by the end of the episode, has demolished most of the property on Conch Street and has shown no remorse. She drives off. The status quo returns. SpongeBob's house and Squidward's house are intact again in the next episode, with no acknowledgement of the destruction. The fan reaction to Big Sister Sam was harsh. The episode was criticized for the same reason most Season 7 episodes were criticized at the time, which is that it portrayed Patrick as a casually cruel and unapologetic jerk who supports his sister's destruction of his neighbors' homes. The continuity contradiction with Something Smells was an additional layer of frustration. The fan wikis began to flag the discrepancy. Sam's existence had directly broken a piece of canon that had been on the books for nearly a decade. The official explanation, when one was eventually offered, was that Patrick had simply forgotten. The Season 4 episode, I'm With Stupid, which aired on June 17, 2005, established that Patrick's memory was unreliable to the point of being a personality trait. In I'm With Stupid, Patrick's parents come to visit, and Patrick, anxious about disappointing them, asks SpongeBob to pretend to be even dumber than Patrick to make Patrick look smart by comparison. SpongeBob agrees and does the routine. Patrick's parents are charmed. Then a misunderstanding occurs, and the episode reveals that the two fish Patrick had been calling his parents were, in fact, total strangers from out of town. Patrick had been so disconnected from his actual family that he had welcomed two unrelated fish into his house and treated them as his mother and father for the entire episode without noticing the substitution. His real parents, who are pink starfish like he is, eventually arrive. Patrick, watching them walk in, is briefly uncertain about their identity as well. The implication of I'm With Stupid is that Patrick's grasp on his own family is, at best, vague. The episode established, in 2005, that Patrick could simply forget who his parents were. The Big Sister Sam contradiction in this reading is consistent with that earlier canon. Patrick said he did not have a sister in Something Smells because he had forgotten he had a sister. The same character could later remember he had a sister in Big Sister Sam because the memory had returned to him. The reading is functional. It is also unsatisfying. Forgetting that one has parents is a character trait that the show plays for comedy and never fully commits to. Forgetting that one has a sister, especially a sister as physically enormous and personally destructive as Sam, is a different scale of forgetting. The episode Something Smells does not frame Patrick's denial as a memory problem. He delivers the line as a small joke about being slightly addled. He is not in a state of cognitive impairment. He is just not paying attention. The __quote _8 _ explanation, while internally consistent with I'm With Stupid, requires a level of forgetting that the original line was not built to support. The contradiction, having survived the Sam episode, was then deepened further by a third entry, The Patrick Star Show, a spin-off series that premiered on Nickelodeon on July 9, 2021, introduced Patrick's family as a complete unit. The family includes a father, a mother, a grandfather, and two siblings. One of the siblings is a younger sister named Squidina Star, who is a squid rather than a starfish. Squidina was adopted into the Star family as an infant. She is, by the canon of The Patrick Star Show, Patrick's sister. The show treats her as such. Patrick interacts with her as a younger sister. The family unit functions. Sam Star does not appear as a regular character in The Patrick Star Show. She appears in the background of two episodes, Klopnodian Heritage Festival and Tying the Klop Knot, as a non-speaking presence. The current showrunner, Vincent Waller, has stated that the production team, when developing The Patrick Star Show, considered including Sam as a regular character, but ultimately replaced her with Squidina. The replacement was not officially explained. Sam was demoted to a background figure. Squidina took the sister role. The result, by 2026, is that Patrick Star has had 3 different sister statuses across his fictional history. history. In Season 2 of the original show, he has no sister. In Season 7, he has Sam. In the Patrick Star Show, his sister is Squidina, with Sam reduced to a distant relative whose status as a sister is no longer being foregrounded. The show has never resolved which of these is correct, and each new entry has been allowed to stand without being formally reconciled with the previous one. The official position of the Encyclopedia SpongeBobia wiki is that Sam and Squidina both exist, that Patrick simply forgot Sam in Something Smells, and that the absence of Squidina from earlier episodes is unexplained. The unofficial position is that the writers, across 2 decades, have been writing Patrick's family as if each new episode were the first one to do so. The deepest version of this contradiction sits inside the episode Rule of Dumb, which aired on December 6th, 2006. The episode reveals Patrick's family tree, going back generations to medieval times. The family tree is shown in detail. It includes ancestors, cousins, uncles, and various other relations. Sam is not on the tree. Squidina, who would not be created for another 15 years, is also not on the tree. The medieval Star family, by the canon of Rule of Dumb, did not include the line of descent that would produce either of Patrick's eventual sisters. The contradiction works in the other direction too. The Sam who arrived in 2011 should have been somewhere on the tree shown in 2006. She was not. Patrick, by the canon of multiple episodes including The Secret Box, has been SpongeBob's best friend since the day they were born. The Secret Box establishes that the two of them met in the hospital on the day of their respective births and have been inseparable ever since. The Truth or Square flashback, which shows SpongeBob being born in a hospital bed to a placental mother, does not show Patrick in the room. The Patrick Star Show flashbacks, which show Patrick being born inside a barnacle shell, also do not show SpongeBob. The two characters, despite being canonically lifelong best friends, have origin stories that do not include each other. The cumulative effect of all of these contradictions is that Patrick's family in 2026 is officially undefined. He has parents who are sometimes the right starfish and sometimes random visitors he has confused for his parents. He has a grandfather who appears in 2 episodes. He may or may not have a sister named Sam, depending on which season of the original show is being treated as primary canon. He has a sister named Squidina, who exists only in the spin-off series. He has ancestors going back to the medieval period who do not include any of his current siblings on their family tree. The character is, structurally, a person whose family rewrites itself every few years and whose memory is canonically too unreliable to be trusted as a tiebreaker. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Patrick's family rewriting itself is an ongoing contradiction, but there is a holiday in Bikini Bottom that the show forgot it had introduced. In the next section, we walk through the Christmas that was mentioned a year before the city had ever heard of it. Section 5, the Christmas that came before Christmas. The Season 1 episode Jellyfishing aired on September 2nd, 1999, as the second segment of the 7th episode of the series. The plot is a small one. Squidward is recovering from a workplace injury at the Krusty Krab, and SpongeBob and Patrick decide to cheer him up by taking him jellyfishing for the day. Squidward, who has no interest in jellyfishing, is dragged along anyway. The episode ends with Squidward being attacked by the king jellyfish and humiliated in front of the entire neighborhood. The premise is comedic. The execution is built around physical gags. There is no holiday in the episode. There is no winter setting. There is no tree, no decoration, no snow, no gift exchange. The episode is set in what appears to be a normal day in Bikini Bottom. In the middle of the episode, however, there is a single line of dialogue. SpongeBob and Patrick, in a moment of cheerful enthusiasm, present Squidward with a hat and a horn as part of his quote 9 celebration. Patrick, holding a wrapped gift in his hand, smiles at Squidward and shouts the words quote 10. The line is delivered as a casual exclamation. It is not commented on. It is not returned to. It is the kind of throwaway dialogue that the writers of a Season 1 cartoon would have inserted without thinking, because the phrase underscore underscore quote underscore 11 underscore underscore was a familiar verbal shortcut for the kind of generic happy celebration energy the scene was trying to communicate. The line establishes, in canon, that Patrick knew the phrase Merry Christmas in September 1999. The line does not say anything more than that. Patrick says it. Squidward does not react to the phrase as if it is unfamiliar. SpongeBob, standing next to Patrick, does not react either. Christmas, in the world of jellyfishing, is a known concept. The characters use the phrase casually. The viewer absorbs it without thinking about it. 15 months later, on December 7th, 2000, Nickelodeon aired the episode episode Christmas Who, which was the 8th episode of Season 2 and the first double-length episode in the show's run. The premise of Christmas Who is, on paper, the opposite of what jellyfishing had quietly established. The plot is built around the idea that nobody in Bikini Bottom has ever heard of Christmas. The entire city is unfamiliar with the holiday. Sandy Cheeks, in the opening of the episode, brings a Christmas tree into her tree dome. SpongeBob, walking through the dome, sees the tree and panics, mistaking it for a fire hazard. He tries to put the tree out with a hose. Sandy stops him. She then asks him, with growing disbelief, if he has never seen a Christmas tree before. SpongeBob, in this episode, has not. He does not know what a Christmas tree is. He does not know what Christmas is. Sandy then walks him through the entire concept of the holiday, explaining the existence of Santa Claus, the practice of writing letters, the tradition of gift exchange, and the various other elements of the surface world celebration. SpongeBob is fascinated. He immediately runs to the Krusty Krab to share the new information with Patrick, Squidward, and Mr. Krabs. None of them have heard of Christmas either. The episode treats the introduction of the holiday to Bikini Bottom as a community-wide event. SpongeBob writes a letter to Santa. Mr. Krabs writes a letter. Patrick writes a letter. The entire city writes letters. SpongeBob then designs a device that shoots the letters in bottles up to the surface of the ocean so Santa can find them. The implication is that this is the first Christmas Bikini Bottom has ever attempted to celebrate. The contradiction with jellyfishing is direct. Patrick, in Christmas Who, is encountering Christmas for the first time. Patrick, in jellyfishing, used the phrase Merry Christmas as a casual exclamation more than a year earlier in the airing schedule. Both episodes are part of the official canon. Both episodes are still in rotation. Both episodes are still on streaming. Neither has been edited to fix the contradiction. The jellyfishing reference is not the only one. The Season 1 episode, Sandy's Rocket, which aired on September 3rd, 1999, includes a brief scene in which SpongeBob is shown wearing a Santa hat to bed. The hat is not commented on. It is just a Santa hat on his head as part of his pajama outfit. The episode does not pause to explain why SpongeBob owns a Santa hat in a city that does not know what Santa is. The Season 1 episode, Scaredy Pants, which aired on October 28th, 2000, includes a moment in which Patrick opens a closet in SpongeBob's house and finds, among the various items inside, a fully decorated Christmas tree. The tree is treated as a normal object. Patrick does not ask SpongeBob why he has a Christmas tree in his closet. SpongeBob does not explain it. The tree is just there. The Season 2 episode, Mermaid Man and Barnacle Boy 2, which aired on July 26th, 2000, several months before Christmas Who, includes a scene in which SpongeBob, Mermaid Man, and Barnacle Boy break into a variation of the song Jingle Bells. The variation is sung casually, as a kind of background activity, with all three of them carrying the melody together. None of them treat the song as unfamiliar. None of them ask what the words mean. Jingle Bells, the most famous Christmas carol in American culture, is treated as a song the characters already know. The Season 2 episode, Your Shoes Untied, which aired on February 17th, 2001, contains a song called Loop de Loop, in which a Christmas bow is referenced as part of the lyrics. The bow is mentioned in passing. The mention does not pause the song. The contradiction, taken in full, is that the canon of SpongeBob's first season and a half contains at least 4 separate references to Christmas, by name, by song, by physical object, and by exclamation. And then, in December 2000, the show aired an episode that established that nobody in Bikini Bottom had ever heard of Christmas. The 4 earlier references should not exist. The 4 earlier references do exist. The show has aired all 5 episodes in continuous rotation for over 25 years. The depth of the contradiction goes further once Christmas Who itself is examined for its internal logic. The picture of Santa that SpongeBob shows to Mr. Krabs, Patrick, and Squidward in the episode is, by the show's own design choices, the official Santa illustration used by the Coca-Cola Company in their decades-long holiday advertising campaigns. The image is recognizable. It is the version of Santa that almost every American child grew up seeing on television commercials and supermarket displays from the 1930s onward. The choice to use that exact image is meaningful. The writers of Christmas Who wanted the audience to immediately recognize the figure SpongeBob was holding up. The choice also implies, inside the canon of the show, that the Coca-Cola Santa image somehow exists in Bikini Bottom in a form that SpongeBob can hold up as a printed picture, even though the residents of of the city have never heard of the figure he is presenting. The image came from somewhere. The episode does not explain where. There is also the matter of the snowfall. Christmas Who, in its closing sequence, shows snow falling inside Bikini Bottom. The snow is visible on the streets, on the roofs, and on the bodies of the residents. Snow is a surface world phenomenon. It is, by every law of physics that the show has ever respected, impossible underwater. Bikini Bottom is at the bottom of the ocean. Frozen water in an environment that is already water should not be able to fall through the water as discrete flakes. The episode does not address the impossibility. The snow falls. The episode ends. The next episode of the show, which aired the following week, returns to a normal, non-snowy Bikini Bottom, with no acknowledgement that snow had ever been there. The snow, like the Coca-Cola Santa image, simply exists for the duration of the holiday special and then disappears. The Christmas-related contradictions deepen further in the episodes that came after Christmas Who. The season 6 episode, It's a SpongeBob Christmas, which aired on November 23, 2012, treats Christmas as a fully established annual tradition in Bikini Bottom. The episode involves Plankton attempting to use a fruitcake-based scheme to manipulate the city's residents during the holiday season. The premise of the episode requires the residents of Bikini Bottom to be familiar with Christmas, with fruitcake as a holiday food, with Santa Claus as an annual visitor, and with the entire framework of seasonal celebration. The episode does not pause to explain how a city that had never heard of Christmas in 2000 had absorbed the entire tradition by 2012. The audience is expected to accept that Christmas is now a normal part of life in Bikini Bottom, in spite of the fact that the introduction of the holiday in the canon is a single double-length episode that aired 12 years earlier. The fan side attempts to reconcile this have generally taken one of three approaches. The first approach is to argue that the early references were in the show's pre-canon era, before the writers had decided what was and was not allowed to exist in Bikini Bottom. The argument is that the first season was loose enough that small references slipped through without being checked, and that Christmas Who represents the actual canonical introduction of the holiday, with the earlier mentions being effectively ignored by the show's later continuity. The argument is functional. The argument also requires the viewer to accept that the show, in its first season, was operating under different rules than the show in its second season, which is not a position the show itself has ever taken. The second approach is to argue that the residents of Bikini Bottom were aware of the existence of the word Christmas in some general sense, having absorbed it from various sources, but had no concrete understanding of what the holiday actually involved. Patrick, in this reading, knew the phrase, quote 13, the way a person who has never been to Italy knows the word, quote 14. He could deploy the phrase as a generic greeting without ever knowing what it referenced. SpongeBob owned a Santa hat the way a person might own a souvenir from a place they have never visited. The Christmas tree in the closet was a decoration he had acquired without understanding. The argument is more elegant. It also has to explain why nobody in Christmas Who recognizes the word Christmas at all, when the same characters had used the word casually in earlier episodes. The third approach is the one the show's own writers have implicitly adopted, which is that the contradiction simply exists and does not need to be resolved. The show, in 1999 and 2000, was being produced episode by episode, with no overarching canon document. The writers of Jellyfishing did not consult the writers of Christmas Who, because Christmas Who did not exist yet. The writers of Christmas Who, when they sat down to plan the holiday special, did not go back and watch every previous episode for references to Christmas. They wrote the special on the assumption that they were introducing the holiday to Bikini Bottom for the first time, because in their imagination, that was the story. The result was that the show, by accident, ended up with a holiday that had been mentioned 5 times before it was officially introduced. There is a fourth approach that has emerged in the years since, which involves taking the post-apocalyptic Bikini Bottom theory seriously and asking what the implications of the theory would be for the city's relationship with surface world holidays. If Bikini Bottom is, by Mr. Lawrence's confirmation, the surviving fragment of a world that ended in nuclear testing, then the residents of the city would have inherited fragments of pre-apocalyptic culture without inheriting the full context. They would know certain phrases. They would know certain songs. They would not know what those phrases and songs originally referred to. Patrick saying Merry Christmas in Jellyfishing in this reading is not a contradiction of the canon of Christmas Who. It is evidence of the inherited cultural fragments that the city has absorbed from the surface without understanding. Sandy, who is from the surface, brings the actual Christmas knowledge with her in Christmas Who and explains the holiday to people who have only ever known its echoes. The reading is interesting. The reading is also not supported by the show. Christmas Who does not present Sandy as the first surface dweller to bring information to Bikini Bottom about a forgotten holiday. Sandy, in the episode, simply explains that she is the only resident of the city who knows what Christmas is, because she comes from the surface, and the rest of the city has never been exposed to it. The framing is that Christmas is a surface world thing that has not yet reached the underwater city. The framing does not allow for the Patrick line in jellyfishing. There is also a fifth approach that some fans have proposed, which is that the residents of Bikini Bottom have been aware of Christmas for a long time, but had simply never celebrated it as a community before the events of Christmas Who. The argument distinguishes between knowing about a holiday and observing a holiday. A person can know that Diwali exists without ever lighting a lamp for it. A person can know what Easter is without ever attending a service. The residents of Bikini Bottom in this reading knew about Christmas the way a non-Christian American might know about Christmas, with a working knowledge of the phrase, the songs, and the basic decorations, but with no personal practice of the holiday. Christmas Who is the episode in which the city decides for the first time to actually try celebrating it. The reading is functional. It is also, again, not supported by the dialogue inside Christmas Who, which has SpongeBob asking Sandy what a Christmas tree even is, as if he had never encountered the concept of the tree itself before. The simpler explanation is the one that aligns with the show's actual production history. The Christmas references in the early episodes were not planned. They slipped in. The writers of Christmas Who, when they wrote the special, decided to treat the holiday as a new arrival, because that was the story they wanted to tell. The earlier references were not retroactively edited out, because the show, by 2000, was already too large to clean up after itself. The contradiction has been sitting on the canon shelf for 25 years, and it has never been addressed. The result is one of the cleanest examples in the show of how the floating timeline interacts with episode-to-episode amnesia. The world of Bikini Bottom does not have a fixed cultural memory. What the residents know in one episode does not have to match what they know in another episode. Christmas was a known concept in 1999. Christmas was an unknown concept in 2000. Christmas was a fully established annual tradition by 2012. All three versions are canon. The show has not chosen between them, and the show is not going to. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Christmas appearing before Christmas is a contradiction in cultural memory, but the deepest contradiction in the show's canon involves the recipe at the center of the entire restaurant. In the next section, we walk through the three different origin stories of the Krabby Patty. Section 6, the floating timeline and why the sponge will never get older. The first theory the fan community has used to explain the timeline errors of SpongeBob SquarePants is also the simplest. The theory is that the show operates inside a floating timeline, which is a structural device used by almost every long-running animated series in the history of television, and that most of the contradictions inside the canon are downstream consequences of that single design choice. The theory does not require any supernatural mechanism. It does not require a multiverse. It does not require a dream or a post-apocalyptic backstory. It simply requires the viewer to accept that time inside Bikini Bottom does not work the way time works in the real world, and that the writers of the show have been operating under that assumption since 1997. A floating timeline, by the formal definition that has been used in the animation and comics industries for almost a century, is a setting in which characters age little or not at all, while the world around them remains contemporary to the audience watching. Time inside a floating timeline exists for the world. Time does not exist for the people who live in the world. Bart Simpson has been 10 years old since 1989. Lisa has been 8 years old for the same amount of time. Maggie has been a baby for over 35 years. Mickey Mouse has been roughly the same age since the 1920s. Garfield has been the same overweight orange cat since 1978. Charlie Brown has been a child since 1950. SpongeBob, by joining this tradition, was simply choosing a strategy that almost every commercially successful, long-running animated series has adopted at some point. The reason cartoons use this strategy is partly creative and partly commercial. The creative reason is that aging characters lock writers into stories about aging, and aging stories tend to end. A character who turns 80 will eventually have to deal with retirement, illness, or death, and most children's cartoons are not built for those subjects. A character who stays the same age can have 10,000 adventures in any order, and every adventure character can feel fresh. The commercial reason is that a frozen character can be sold as merchandise indefinitely. SpongeBob plush dolls produced in 2001 still look exactly like the SpongeBob plush dolls produced in 2025. The brand stays stable, the character stays sellable. Hillenburg, who hated the merchandising of the show, would have had mixed feelings about the second reason, but the creative reason was already enough on its own to justify the choice. The floating timeline, as a theory, fixes the largest single timeline error in the show, which is the contradiction between SpongeBob's birth date of July 14th, 1986, and the fact that the show has been on the air since 1999. By the canon of his sleepy time and no free rides driver's license, SpongeBob would have been 12 years old when the show premiered, 24 by 2010, and 38 by the show's 25th anniversary. None of those numbers fit anything the show has ever depicted. The character has never aged on screen. The floating timeline explains why. SpongeBob did not age because the show was never tracking his age. The 1986 birth date was a small joke that the writers placed on the license without expecting anyone to take it seriously. And once it became clear that fans were taking it seriously, the show simply stopped including birth dates on character licenses. Patrick's license has no birth date. Mr. Wadzittuya's license has no birth date. The blank field is the floating timeline at work. The same theory fixes the contradiction inside Goodbye Krabby Patty, where Squidward casually mentions that he has been working at the Krusty Krab for 17 years. The line is a deliberate inside joke about the show's own real-world runtime, since 17 years was roughly the gap between the show's premiere in 1999 and the production of that episode in 2016. The line was not meant to be canonical. It was a self-aware nod to the audience, acknowledging that the show had been on the air for a long time, delivered through a character who would normally not have been allowed to acknowledge any specific length of his own life. The floating timeline framework explains why the line is allowed to exist alongside the canon of Help Wanted, which depicts Squidward as already exhausted by the job on the day SpongeBob arrived, and alongside the canon of Truth or Square, which depicts Squidward in his pre-SpongeBob garden era. All three depictions are, in a sense, true. None of them is meant to be tracked against the others. The floating timeline lets each version of Squidward's tenure exist inside its own episode, without requiring any version to be the canonical one. The technology drift inside the show is another contradiction the floating timeline fixes cleanly. The early seasons of SpongeBob, from 1999 through about 2004, depict a world that uses landline telephones, single-bulb televisions, and paper newspapers delivered to doorsteps. The mid-period seasons begin introducing flat-screen monitors, more complex versions of Karen the supercomputer, and the kind of small electronic conveniences that the real world had developed by that point. The later seasons, from about 2017 onward, openly include smartphones, social media, and a level of internet integration that would have been impossible to depict in 1999. The technology in the world keeps drifting forward in line with the real world. The characters using the technology never drift forward. SpongeBob holds a flip phone in one episode and a smartphone in the next, and his hand is the same hand. His age is the same age. His house is the same house. The world is changing around him, and he is exactly where he was the day he first arrived at the Krusty Krab. This is the floating timeline working as designed. The world ages, the character does not. The theory also fixes the contradiction in SB129, where the calendar in the future reads March 6th, 4017, suggesting that the present day of the show is March 6th, 2017. The fan community has spent years debating whether this calendar should be taken as the official date of the entire series, and the answer, under the floating timeline framework, is no. The calendar was a small visual joke by the animators, who picked a year that looked sufficiently future-y. It was not meant to function as a canonical timestamp. The show's present day is whenever the audience is watching it. The episode that aired in 1999 took place in 1999. The episode that aired in 2017 took place in 2017. The episode that will air in 2030 will take place in 2030. SpongeBob does not get older across that gap, but the world around him does, and the world around him keeps catching up to the audience in real time. There is a useful comparison to make with The Simpsons here, which operates on the same floating timeline but handles the contradictions differently. The Simpsons has, over its run, gone through a notorious series of flashback episodes that have repeatedly rewritten the family's history. Homer and Marge Marge, in the early seasons, were depicted as having met in the late 1970s. In later seasons, the writers shifted the meeting to the late 1980s, then to the early 1990s, then eventually into the 2000s. The Simpsons fan community has spent decades cataloging these contradictions. The show, in a few episodes, has even made self-aware jokes about the impossibility of tracking its own canon. SpongeBob does not do this. SpongeBob, in each new episode, acts as if the canon being established in that episode is the canon, without acknowledging the contradictions accumulating across the rest of the series. The behavior is consistent with how the floating timeline is supposed to work. Each episode is its own present. The connections between episodes are loose by design. The floating timeline, however, does not fix every contradiction in the show. It explains why characters do not age. It does not explain why characters remember different things in different episodes. SpongeBob's first words being quote 16 in Help Wanted and quote 17 in Truth or Square is not a contradiction that the floating timeline can resolve, because the floating timeline does not change what a character has said. It only changes when the character was alive. Patrick having no sister in Something Smells and having a sister named Sam in Big Sister Sam is a contradiction that the floating timeline cannot resolve, because the existence of a sibling is not an age-related fact. The Krabby Patty being invented by Mr. Krabs and Plankton in a dump in Friend or Foe and being passed down from Mama Krabs in Enemy In-Law is not a floating timeline issue. It is a memory issue. It is a continuity issue. It is something else. The floating timeline is the foundation of every other theory the fan community has built. The other theories work, in some sense, because the floating timeline has already opened the door. Once a show has decided that time does not track linearly inside its world, the door is open for other kinds of looseness. Memory does not have to track. Backstory does not have to track. Family relationships do not have to track. The floating timeline is the first concession the show makes to the impossibility of long-term continuity, and every other concession follows from it. The theory cannot fix every error. It can only fix the foundational ones, the ones that involve age, time, and the basic forward motion of the world. What the floating timeline gives the show, in exchange for the contradictions it generates, is the ability to keep going. SpongeBob in 2026 is the same SpongeBob who arrived at the Krusty Krab in 1999. He has not gotten older. He has not lost his job. He has not moved out of his pineapple. He has not stopped being friends with Patrick. The world around him has changed almost completely, with new technology, new spin-off shows, new movies, and new characters being introduced regularly. But the character himself has remained the same. This is the trade. The contradictions are the cost of the stability. The stability is the reason the show is still on the air. Hillenburg, in 1997, made the decision that the show would never grow up. The decision has held for over 27 years. The contradictions that the decision has generated are, in this reading, not bugs in the canon. They are the natural exhaust of a strategy that has worked exactly as intended. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The floating timeline fixes the age problem, but it cannot fix the family problem or the backstory problem. In the next section, we walk through the multiverse theory and the alternate timelines that the show has officially confirmed. Section 7, the multiverse theory and the alternate timelines. The show has already confirmed the second theory the fan community has used to explain the timeline errors of SpongeBob SquarePants is the multiverse theory. The argument is that the contradictions inside the show can be resolved by the existence of multiple parallel timelines, each branching off from the main canon at different decision points, each containing its own version of the characters and events. The theory has the advantage of being supported directly by canonical material from inside the show itself. It is not a fan invention that has been imposed on the canon from the outside. It is a mechanism the show's own writers have introduced in specific episodes to explain specific contradictions, and the mechanism has now been formally extended to cover at least one of the show's spin-off series. The first appearance of an alternate timeline inside the canon of SpongeBob is the Season 3 episode, The Algae's Always Greener, which aired on October 11th, 2002. The plot of the episode is built around Plankton expressing frustration with his life. He has been failing to steal the Krabby Patty formula for years. He has been eating holographic meatloaf for dinner. His restaurant has no customers. He looks across the street at the Krusty Krab and decides that Mr. Krabs' life is easier than his. He activates a device, which he calls a switcher that swaps the lives of the two of them. The device works. Plankton wakes up the next morning inside Mr. Krabs' body, in Mr. Krabs' house, with Mr. Krabs' daughter Pearl calling him Daddy. Mr. Krabs, on the other side of the swap, wakes up inside Plankton's body, married to Karen, running the chum bucket. The episode plays out the consequences of the swap for most of its runtime. Plankton, in Mr. Krabs' life, is overwhelmed by the responsibilities. Mr. Krabs, in Plankton's life, is humiliated by the failure. The episode ends with the swap being reversed and the original timeline being restored. The episode treats the swapped reality as a real thing. The world that exists during the swap is not a hallucination. It is not a dream. It is a functioning version of Bikini Bottom, in which the relationships between the main characters are different. Pearl, in the swapped reality, treats Plankton as her father. Karen, in the swapped reality, treats Mr. Krabs as her husband. The implication of the episode is that the SpongeBob universe contains, at minimum, two parallel realities, and that those realities can be accessed and exited through the use of specific devices. The mechanism is not explained in detail. The show simply commits to the existence of the alternate reality and then walks away from it at the end of the episode. The Algae's Always Greener was, for many years, the only canonical example of an alternate timeline inside the show. It was treated as a one-episode comedic premise. The fan community noted its existence, but did not extend it into a larger theory of how the show's contradictions worked. The episode was seen as a self-contained story, rather than a structural admission about the nature of the canon. The position of the multiverse theory inside the franchise changed permanently when the spin-off series Camp Coral premiered on Paramount Plus on March 4th, 2021. The series is, on paper, a prequel to the main show. It depicts SpongeBob, Patrick, Sandy, Squidward, and the other main characters as 10-year-old children attending a summer sleepaway camp run by Mr. Krabs. The premise is, in television terms, an aged-down origin story for the entire main cast. The contradictions with the main show, as we walked through in Section 7 of the timeline error half of this video, were severe. SpongeBob and Sandy meeting as children at Camp Coral directly contradicts their adult meeting in Tea at the Tree Dome. The depiction of Squidward as only slightly older than SpongeBob contradicts the main show's depiction of him as a full generation older. The depiction of Christmas being celebrated at Camp Coral contradicts the canon of Christmas Who. The list goes on. The franchise's response to these contradictions was not to ignore them. It was to formally introduce the multiverse mechanic into the canon. The Season 2 Camp Coral episode Kitchen Sponge, which aired in 2024, established that the events of Camp Coral take place in an alternate timeline created by Sandy's adult self, sending her younger self back in time to attend the camp, in order to prevent Plankton from stealing the Krabby Patty formula. In some way, the episode does not fully explain. The framing was an explicit acknowledgement by the franchise's own writers that the prequel and the main show could not both be the same continuity. A multiverse mechanic was the only way to keep both as canon without forcing one to overwrite the other. The multiverse, by 2024, was no longer a one-episode premise from 2002. It was an official structural feature of the franchise. The multiverse theory, applied to the timeline errors we walked through in the first half of this video, fixes a remarkable number of them. Patrick having no sister in Something Smells, having a sister named Sam in Big Sister Sam, and having a different sister named Squidina in The Patrick Star Show is no longer a contradiction. Each version of Patrick exists in a different timeline. The Patrick of the early seasons is an only child. The Patrick of the late seasons has Sam. The Patrick of the spin-off series has Squidina. The medieval family tree shown in Rule of Dumb belongs to a timeline in which neither sister exists. Each timeline is internally consistent. The contradictions between the timelines are not contradictions inside the canon, because the canon now formally accepts that there are multiple canons. The same logic applies to Sandy's two arrivals in Bikini Bottom. The Tea at the Tree Dome version, where Sandy meets SpongeBob as an adult and is unaware that he cannot breathe air, is the main timeline. The Camp Coral version, where Sandy has known SpongeBob since they were 10 years old, is the alternate timeline, created by Sandy's adult self traveling back in time. Both versions are canon. Both versions happened. The reason the Sandy of the main show has no memory of having known SpongeBob since childhood is because, in the main timeline, she did not. The childhood friendship belongs to the alternate timeline. The two Sandys are, in some sense, two different people, each shaped shaped by the events of her own reality. The Krabby Patty's 3 origin stories also resolve cleanly under the multiverse theory. The friend or foe origin, in which the recipe was created by accident in a childhood dump fight between Mr. Krabs and Plankton, is the main canonical origin. The enemy-in-law line, in which the recipe was passed down from Mama Krabs, belongs to a different timeline in which the Krabs family had access to the formula generations earlier. The Dunces and Dragons medieval origin, in which the recipe was held by King Krabs in his castle, is a third timeline that may or may not have been created by SpongeBob's time travel inside the episode. Each origin story is a window into a different reality. None of them has to be the only true one. The Krabby Patty, in this reading, is one of those rare foods that has emerged independently in multiple timelines, with each timeline producing its own version of the same recipe. The multiverse theory also explains why the various SpongeBob movies contain elements that do not fit neatly with the main show. The first feature film, which premiered in 2004, depicts David Hasselhoff carrying SpongeBob and Patrick across the surface of the ocean, with humans clearly existing as a normal part of the world. The Sponge on the Run film from 2020 contains flashback sequences that establish the same Camp Coral childhood that the spin-off series would later expand. The Saving Bikini Bottom film from 2024 introduces the Bots organization as Sandy's actual employer, contradicting the Treedome Enterprises chimpanzees from Chimps Ahoy. The Plankton movie from 2025 deepens the Karen backstory in ways that do not match all of her prior appearances. Each of these films, under the multiverse framework, is a self-contained timeline. The contradictions between the films and the main show are not failures of canon. They are evidence that the franchise is now operating across a documented set of parallel realities, with each piece of media occupying its own slot in the larger structure. There is a deeper application of the multiverse theory that some fans have proposed, which involves the small contradictions that appear within the main show itself. SpongeBob's house, in different episodes, has different numbers of rooms and a different internal layout. The Krusty Krab kitchen, in different episodes, sometimes has deep fryers and sometimes does not. Karen, in different episodes, is a giant wall-mounted supercomputer and a small wheeled portable computer. Each of these small inconsistencies, under the multiverse framework, can be read as a brief excursion into a parallel reality where the small detail is slightly different. The episode begins in one timeline, slips briefly into another, and returns to the main timeline by the end. The viewer does not notice the slip. The contradictions accumulate without breaking the show, because each episode is, in some sense, free to choose which version of the world it is operating in. The disadvantage of the multiverse theory is that it is too powerful. A theory that can explain any contradiction can, in some sense, explain none of them, because there is no version of the canon that the theory cannot accommodate. If every inconsistency is the result of a different timeline, then the show has no internal logic at all, only an infinite collection of parallel logics, each of which is locally consistent and globally meaningless. The multiverse theory works as a cataloging system. It does not work as an explanation, because its explanatory range is too wide to constrain anything. A fan who accepts the multiverse theory as the answer to every contradiction is, in effect, accepting that the show has no canon at all, only a collection of self-contained episodes that happen to share characters and locations. The other disadvantage is that the multiverse theory, when applied broadly, removes the emotional weight of any specific moment in the show. If the version of SpongeBob who lost a friend in one episode is not the same version of SpongeBob who appears in the next episode, then the loss does not carry forward. If the Squidward who admitted he missed SpongeBob in SB129 is in a different timeline from the Squidward who hates him in Are You Happy Now, then neither moment has any weight on the other. The audience, watching the show, has invested decades of emotional energy in characters whose continuity is, by the multiverse framework, fundamentally unstable. Most fans, even the ones who find the theory intellectually satisfying, do not actually want to apply it broadly. The price is too high. They accept the multiverse for the specific cases the show itself has confirmed, like Camp Coral, and they leave the rest of the contradictions for the other theories to handle. The multiverse theory, in its current form, is partial. It fixes the contradictions the show has formally confirmed as alternate timeline cases. It can be extended to fix several other major contradictions, including Patrick's sisters and the Krabby Patty's origins, if the viewer is willing to accept the extension. It does not fix every error, because the show has not officially extended the multiverse mechanic organic to every episode. The theory works best when used selectively. It works worst when used as a universal solvent. The fan community, in 2026, has settled into a position where the multiverse is treated as one tool among several, rather than the single answer to every question. What the multiverse theory ultimately offers, beyond its specific applications, is permission. It is the show giving its audience permission to stop trying to fit every episode into a single coherent history. The canon is no longer required to add up. The contradictions are no longer required to be resolved. The viewer can watch any episode in any order, accept whatever the episode says about its world, and not worry about whether that version of the world matches the version in the previous episode. This permission was, in some sense, what Hillenburg had been encouraging from the beginning. The multiverse theory, formalized through Camp Coral and Kitchen Sponge, simply made his approach into something the audience could name. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The multiverse handles the alternate timeline contradictions, but the contradictions inside individual characters' memories need a different kind of fix. In the next section, we walk through the unreliable narrator theory. Section 8, the unreliable narrator theory and the lies the characters tell about their own lives. The third theory the fan community has used to explain the timeline errors of SpongeBob SquarePants is the unreliable narrator theory. The argument is that many of the contradictions inside the show are not contradictions in the world itself, but contradictions in the way the characters describe the world. The flashbacks, the origin stories, the casual references to past events, the offhand mentions of relationships and family members are not objective windows into a fixed history. They are stories that the characters are telling, sometimes to each other, sometimes to themselves, and the stories are not always true. The theory has the advantage of being grounded in actual on-screen evidence, because the show, in at least one major episode, has explicitly built its entire structure around the premise that its characters lie about their own histories. The episode that establishes the unreliable narrator framework most directly is the Season 5 premiere, Friend or Foe, which aired on April 13th, 2007. The structure of the episode is built around three competing accounts of the same event, each told by a different character, each contradicting the others, with the audience being asked to figure out which account is the truth. After yet another failed attempt by Plankton to steal the Krabby Patty formula, SpongeBob asks Mr. Krabs why the two of them hate each other so much. Mr. Krabs sits down and tells his version of the story. The version is dramatic. It positions Mr. Krabs as the victim of Plankton's greed and ambition. It shows the two of them as childhood best friends who eventually parted ways because Plankton wanted to use the patty to dominate the children of the town. Mr. Krabs, in his own telling, was the moral one. Plankton was the corrupt one. Plankton, hearing this, immediately interrupts. He says the story is wrong. He tells his own version. The version is also dramatic. It positions Plankton as the victim and Mr. Krabs as the corrupt one. The events of the story are almost identical, except that the moral roles are reversed. Mr. Krabs, in Plankton's telling, was the one who wanted to dominate the children of the town. Plankton was the one who objected. The two characters argue about whose version is correct. They cannot agree. The episode pauses. Then Karen, Plankton's computer wife, walks into the scene. She tells SpongeBob the real version of the story. The Karen version is the one the audience is meant to accept. It is treated, by the structure of the episode, as the truth. Mr. Krabs and Plankton, in Karen's telling, were not heroic moral combatants on either side. They were two children who built a poisoned hamburger by accident, accused each other of tainting it, and tore the recipe in half during a fight in a dump. Neither of them was the moral one. Both of them were responsible for the poisoning. The Krabby Patty was created by a falling shelf during their argument. The friendship died over a misunderstanding. The truth, by the canon of Friend or Foe, is the one Karen tells. The episode's structure is the unreliable narrator theory in its purest form. The show, in 2007, formally established that two of its main characters had been telling competing, self-flattering versions of their own history for years, and that neither version had been accurate. The audience had been trusting Mr. Krabs' flashbacks. The audience had been trusting Plankton's flashbacks. Both characters had been lying. The show, by allowing Karen to deliver the true version at the end, gave the audience permission to retroactively distrust every flashback the two characters had ever delivered. The implication of the episode, taken seriously, is that flashbacks inside SpongeBob SquarePants are not reliable. They are stories the characters are telling telling. The characters have reasons to lie. Applied across the rest of the show, the unreliable narrator theory fixes a remarkable number of the contradictions we walked through in the first half of this video. The Krabby Patty's 3 origin stories, which we covered in the timeline error half of this script, become resolvable under this framework. The friend or foe origin, told by Karen, is the truth. The enemy-in-law line, in which Mr. Krabs claims the recipe was passed down from his mother, is a lie that Mr. Krabs told to impress his mother's new boyfriend, who happened to be Plankton in disguise. The Dunces and Dragons medieval origin, in which the recipe was held by the medieval King Krabs, is a comedic story that may or may not be reliable, given that the entire episode is built around a time travel premise, in which SpongeBob and Patrick may have generated the medieval origin themselves through paradox. Each of the 3 origin stories has a different narrator. The friend or foe narrator is Karen. The enemy-in-law narrator is Mr. Krabs. The Dunces and Dragons narrator is the show itself, in a comedic register that does not require the audience to accept the events as literally true. The same logic applies to Squidward's flashback in Truth or Square, which shows him as a happy gardener with a fancy garden before SpongeBob's pineapple crushed his flowers. The flashback is delivered by Squidward himself. Squidward, by every other measure across the run of the show, is a deeply unreliable witness to his own life. He believes he is a great clarinet player. He believes he is a brilliant painter. He believes he is an undiscovered artistic genius. The world, by every observable measure, has assessed him accurately as none of these things. A character who has spent decades constructing a romanticized version of his own talent is exactly the kind of character who would also construct a romanticized version of his own past. The garden flashback, under the unreliable narrator framework, is not a literal account of Squidward's pre-SpongeBob life. It is the version Squidward wants to remember, with the difficulties of his actual past edited out, and the piece he believes he was robbed of inserted in their place. The help-wanted version of Squidward, in this reading, is the more accurate one. The character we see in the pilot, already exhausted by his job, already cleaning insulting graffiti off the front window of the restaurant where he works, is a person whose life had been difficult for some time before SpongeBob arrived. The Truth or Square garden was not a real garden. It was Squidward's reconstruction of a happier era that may never have actually existed. The pineapple did not crush a real garden. It crushed the imaginary garden that Squidward had built inside his own memory to make his current unhappiness feel like the result of an external loss rather than the natural condition of his life. The unreliable narrator theory also fixes a significant portion of the Patrick contradictions. Patrick's family, as we walked through earlier in this video, has been rewritten across the run of the show. He has no sister in Something Smells. He has a sister named Sam in Big Sister Sam. He has a different sister named Squidina in The Patrick Star Show. The medieval family tree shown in Rule of Dumb does not include any of these siblings. The contradictions are severe. Under the unreliable narrator framework, the contradictions become a feature of Patrick's character rather than a failure of the show's continuity. The Season 4 episode I'm With Stupid, which aired on June 17, 2005, established that Patrick is so disconnected from his own family that he can welcome 2 unrelated fish into his house and treat them as his mother and father for an entire episode without noticing the substitution. The character, by the canon of that episode, has a memory so unreliable that he cannot accurately identify his own parents. A character who cannot identify his own parents is not a character whose statements about his sister can be trusted. Patrick saying he has no sister in Something Smells is exactly the kind of statement Patrick would make. Patrick saying he has a sister in Big Sister Sam is also exactly the kind of statement Patrick would make. Both statements are equally weighted because the narrator delivering them is canonically incapable of remembering his own family correctly. The Christmas references in early Season 1, which we covered in the 5th section of the timeline error half of this video, can also be fit under the unreliable narrator theory, although the fit is looser. Patrick saying quote, _18__ in jellyfishing in this reading is not a contradiction of the canon of Christmas Who. It is Patrick deploying a phrase he has heard somewhere without understanding what it means. The Patrick of jellyfishing did not know what Christmas was. He knew the phrase, he used the phrase. The phrase did not connect in his own mind to any actual concept of the holiday. When Christmas Who arrived a year later and explained the holiday to him, the explanation did not contradict his earlier use of the phrase. It filled in the meaning that had been missing. The contradiction is not in the world of bikini Bikini Bottom. It is in Patrick's relationship to his own vocabulary. The unreliable narrator framework lets the character know words without knowing what the words mean, which is a description of Patrick that almost any episode of the show would support. The same framework can be applied to SpongeBob's 2 birth stories, which we covered in the second section of the timeline error half of this video. The egg flashback in Your Shoes Untied is delivered by SpongeBob himself as he tries to remember how long his shoelaces have been tied. The hospital flashback in Truth or Square is also delivered through the framework of a memory sequence, this time inside a larger ensemble flashback in the air ducts of the Krusty Krab. Both versions are stories SpongeBob is telling. Neither version is presented by an objective narrator outside the world of the show. Under the unreliable narrator framework, the 2 stories are not contradictory accounts of the same event. They are 2 different memories that SpongeBob has of his own birth, neither of which is necessarily accurate, neither of which is necessarily false. He may have come from an egg. He may have come from a hospital. He may have come from somewhere else entirely. The show is showing the audience the version SpongeBob is currently remembering, not the version that is objectively true. The objective version may not exist. The first words, contradiction, can be handled the same way. Patrick claims, in Help Wanted, that SpongeBob's first words were underscore underscore quote underscore 19 underscore underscore. The Truth or Square flashback shows SpongeBob's first words being Krabby Patty. Both versions are delivered through the memories of characters who may or may not be reliable. Patrick is the one asserting the first version. Patrick has, in I'm with Stupid, demonstrated that he cannot accurately remember his own parents. Patrick claiming to know what SpongeBob's first words were is a claim that should be weighted lightly. The Truth or Square version, delivered through a flashback that is part of a larger comedic sequence, may also not be reliable. Both versions may be wrong. The actual first words of SpongeBob may be something else entirely, or may not exist at all, or may have been forgotten by everyone present at the time. The unreliable narrator framework does not require either version to be correct. It only requires the audience to accept that the people telling the story have reasons not to be trusted. There is a further application of the theory that some fans have proposed, which involves Mr. Krabs' military service. The Krusty Krab training video describes Mr. Krabs as having returned from the war and fallen into a deep depression that seemed endless. The phrasing is heavy. The implication is that the war was a real and damaging experience. Mr. Krabs, however, is also a character who has, across the run of the show, exaggerated almost every detail of his own past for personal gain. He has lied about the price of items at the Krusty Krab. He has lied about his net worth. He has lied to SpongeBob about how much he is paid. The military service, under the unreliable narrator framework, may be partially true and partially exaggerated. The depression may be real. The war stories may be embellished. The character is, by every observable measure, the kind of person who would do this. The framework does not require the war to have happened the way Mr. Krabs claims. It only requires the audience to accept that his account of his own past is, like every other account he has ever delivered, weighted toward making himself look the way he wants to look. The Squidward admission in SB 129, where he confesses that he missed SpongeBob and Patrick after returning from his trip through time, can also be read through the unreliable narrator framework, but in the opposite direction. The admission is one of the few moments in the show where Squidward speaks honestly about his own feelings, without his usual sarcasm or self-flattery. The fact that the show treats the moment with weight, and the fact that the character himself returns to his usual patterns immediately afterward and never references the admission again, suggests that the admission was a brief lapse in his usual narrative. Squidward, in his everyday life, lies about his feelings to himself. The trip through time stripped him of the ability to lie for a moment. He admitted the truth. Then, he returned to the version of himself who would never admit it again. The reason later episodes do not honor the admission is not because the admission was not real. It is because Squidward, in his unreliable everyday narration, has refused to integrate the admission into his ongoing self-image. The disadvantage of the unreliable narrator theory is that it requires the viewer to do significant interpretive work. The show has not provided guidance on which narrators to trust and when. Karen's account in Friend or Foe is treated as the truth, but Karen herself is a computer who could be programmed to believe almost anything. The various flashbacks across the series are not always attributed to a specific narrator. Many of them are simply shown, without commentary, as if they were objective history. The unreliable narrator theory theory can explain individual contradictions when the narrator is identifiable. It cannot explain contradictions where there is no clear narrator at all. The theory works best as a partial solution, applied to specific cases rather than as a universal framework for the entire canon. The other limitation is that the theory, taken too far, undermines the emotional weight of any specific moment in the show. If every flashback is potentially a lie, then no moment of revealed character history can be fully trusted. The friend or foe origin of the Krabby Patty, which is one of the most emotionally weighted pieces of canon in the entire series, becomes provisional. The Krusty Krab training video's depiction of Mr. Krabs' depression becomes provisional. The Truth or Square flashback of SpongeBob's birth becomes provisional. Most fans, even the ones who find the theory intellectually satisfying, do not actually want to apply it to the moments they care about. They apply it selectively to the contradictions that bother them, and they leave the rest of the canon alone. The theory is, in this sense, less a comprehensive solution and more a tool for handling the specific contradictions that the other theories cannot reach. What the unreliable narrator theory ultimately offers, beyond its specific applications, is a way of understanding the show that aligns more closely with how human memory actually works. People do not remember their own pasts accurately. They construct narratives, edit details, exaggerate certain elements, and minimize others. And the version of their own history they tell to other people is rarely the version that actually happened. The characters of SpongeBob, under this framework, are not failures of continuity. They are people, in the loose cartoon sense of the word, doing what people do. They tell stories. The stories do not always match. The stories are still meaningful, even when they are not literally true. The contradictions in the canon are, in this reading, a sign that the show has been treating its characters as people rather than as static records of objective events. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The unreliable narrator handles the lies, but the deeper theory about the world itself is still ahead. In the next section, we walk through the apocalypse, the multiverse, and the dream. Section 9, the apocalypse theory, the multiverse theory, and the dream theory. The contradictions inside SpongeBob SquarePants are too numerous and too consistent to be explained as simple writing mistakes. The fan community over the years has built 3 large theories that attempt to explain why the canon of the show behaves the way it does, why the timeline never tracks, why characters remember things they should not remember and forget things they should not forget, and why the world of Bikini Bottom seems to operate on rules that change from episode to episode. Each of the 3 theories has its supporters. Each of the 3 theories explains some of the contradictions and fails to explain others. None of the 3 has been officially adopted by the show as a whole, although one of them was, in December 2024, partially confirmed on the record by a longtime writer. The first and most ambitious of the 3 is the apocalypse theory. The theory is that Bikini Bottom is the surviving fragment of a world that ended in nuclear testing, and that the residents of the city are mutated descendants of marine life that was exposed to radiation during the atomic detonations at Bikini Atoll between 1946 and 1958. The theory has been circulating in fan communities since at least 2010, when it began appearing on Reddit threads and in early YouTube essays about the show. The evidence for the theory is environmental. The houses in Bikini Bottom are shaped like car mufflers. The lampposts are anchors. The fire hydrants are oxygen tanks. The mailboxes are old diving helmets. The city, when examined as a piece of architecture, appears to be built out of debris that would settle on the ocean floor in the aftermath of a coastal civilization's destruction. The shape of every explosion in the show is a mushroom cloud. The episode Dying for Pie, which aired on November 9th, 2001, contains an explosion that closely resembles a real photograph of the Baker test, the underwater nuclear detonation that occurred at Bikini Atoll on July 25th, 1946. The theory has a specific application to the timeline contradictions. If Bikini Bottom is a post-apocalyptic survivor city, then the cultural memory of the residents would be fragmentary by design. The characters would know certain phrases and certain songs without knowing what those phrases and songs originally referred to. Patrick saying quote _21 in jellyfishing in this reading is a piece of inherited cultural debris from the dead surface world, absorbed without context. Christmas Who then introduces the actual holiday to the city through Sandy, who comes from the surface and brings the surface knowledge with her. The 2 episodes do not contradict each other in this reading. They describe 2 different kinds of cultural relationships relationship with the same surface world tradition. The theory was, for many years, a fan construct without any official acknowledgement. Nickelodeon, when asked about it, gave a brief written statement to Cracked magazine in 2021, saying only that the show was set in Bikini Bottom and declining to comment further. An anonymous staff member in the same article said that the theory was treated inside the network's creative promotions department as well-accepted fan fiction. Nobody officially said yes. In December 2024, the official position changed. Mr. Lawrence, the longtime writer of the show and the voice of Plankton, appeared in an Esquire interview alongside the main cast members of the show. The voice actor Roger Bumpus, who plays Squidward, brought up the long-running fan theory that Bikini Bottom was related to the atomic testing at Bikini Atoll, and mentioned that he had been telling fans for years that the theory was not true. Mr. Lawrence, sitting next to him, immediately corrected him on camera. He confirmed that the theory was, in fact, true. He went further. He said that in the very first season, the writers had asked themselves how far they were going to take the concept, and that the original idea was that the whole world was dead except for Bikini Bottom. The voice actor Bill Fagerbach, who plays Patrick, asked whether the muffler-shaped houses were part of that concept. Mr. Lawrence said yes. The world upstairs, he said, was gone, and Bikini Bottom was what was left. The confirmation, delivered casually inside a magazine interview, transformed the apocalypse theory from a fan construct into a partial piece of canon. The theory was now, by the testimony of one of the show's most senior writers, the original design intent of the series. The cost of the confirmation was that the show, in its actual run, has not been treating the apocalypse theory as canon. The first feature film shows David Hasselhoff, an actual human being, carrying SpongeBob and Patrick across the surface of the ocean on his back. Other episodes, like Pre-Hibernation Week, show living humans interacting with the residents of Bikini Bottom. The surface world, by the canon of these episodes, is alive. The original concept that Mr. Lawrence described, in which the surface was dead, is not the concept the show has executed. Mr. Lawrence himself acknowledged this in the same interview. He said that the concept was where the writers started, but that the show, over the years, drifted away from that strict reading. The result is that the apocalypse theory is officially canon as a foundation, and officially not canon as an active piece of the world. The original design intent has been confirmed. The show's actual content has moved away from the original design. Both versions are now true at the same time. The fan base has accepted this contradiction without much resistance, because the contradiction is, in some sense, smaller than the contradictions the show was already carrying. The second of the three theories is the multiverse theory. The argument is that the contradictions inside the show can be explained by the existence of multiple parallel timelines, each branching off from the main canon at different decision points, each containing its own version of the characters and events. The theory is supported by canonical material from inside the show itself. The Season 3 episode, The Algae's Always Greener, which aired on October 11th, 2002, depicts Plankton using a device to switch lives with Mr. Krabs, creating an alternate reality in which Plankton runs the Krusty Krab and Mr. Krabs runs the Chum Bucket. The episode treats the alternate reality as a real thing, with its own version of every character, before eventually returning to the main timeline. The implication is that the SpongeBob universe contains, at minimum, two parallel realities that can be accessed and exited. The Camp Coral series, which premiered on Paramount Plus on March 4th, 2021, was treated by the franchise's writers as an alternate timeline almost from the moment of its release. The series' contradictions with the main show, particularly around how Sandy met SpongeBob, were too severe to fit into the same canon. The Season 2 Camp Coral episode, Kitchen Sponge, in 2024, formally established that the events of Camp Coral take place in an alternate timeline created by Sandy's adult self, sending her younger self back in time to attend the camp. The framing was an explicit acknowledgement by the franchise's own writers that the prequel and the main show could not both be the same continuity, and that a multiverse mechanic was the only way to keep both as canon without forcing one to overwrite the other. The Season 11 episode, SpongeBob's Big Birthday Blowout, the Season 4 movie, the SpongeBob movie, Sponge on the Run, the Saving Bikini Bottom feature film from 2024, and the Plankton the Movie Netflix release in 2025, each contain elements that contradict either the main show or each other in ways that are most cleanly resolved by treating them as separate timelines. The franchise has, in 2026, no fewer than 5 distinct realities that have been depicted on screen. screen. The original show is one, the Algae's Always Greener swap reality is another, Camp Coral is a third, the various movies form a fourth and fifth, depending on which contradictions are weighted most heavily. The multiverse theory has the advantage of explaining almost every contradiction in the canon without requiring any episode to be ignored. Patrick's sister Sam exists in one timeline. Patrick's sister Squidina exists in another. Patrick's lack of a sister in Something Smells exists in a third. The Krabby Patty was invented in a dump in one timeline, inherited from Mama Krabs in another, and passed down through medieval royalty in a third. SpongeBob met Sandy as an adult in one timeline and as a child at summer camp in another. Each contradiction becomes a window into a different reality. Nothing has to be wrong. Everything has to be partially right. The disadvantage of the multiverse theory is that it solves too many problems at once. A theory that can explain any contradiction can, in some sense, explain none of them, because there is no version of the canon that the theory cannot accommodate. If every inconsistency is the result of a different timeline, then the show has no internal logic at all, only an infinite collection of parallel logics, each of which is locally consistent and globally meaningless. The multiverse theory works as a cataloging system. It does not work as an explanation, because its explanatory range is too wide to constrain anything. The third of the three theories is the dream theory. The argument is that the entire SpongeBob universe is a dream, that Bikini Bottom is a dreamscape rather than a literal place, and that the contradictions inside the canon are the kind of contradictions that occur naturally inside dream logic. The theory has been developed in detail across various fan wikis, with the most extensive version appearing on the SpongeBob's Basics wiki in a long entry titled simply The Dream Theory. According to the wiki's framing, SpongeBob himself represents unfiltered joy and curiosity, the qualities most prominent in childhood, and his endless enthusiasm and naivety symbolize the part of the mind that refuses to succumb to the weight of reality. Bikini Bottom is the stage where SpongeBob's subconscious plays out, filled with exaggerated archetypes. Patrick represents pure id, indulgence and laziness, and blissful ignorance. Plankton represents the shadow self, the darker, ambitious, and envious aspects of the subconscious. The dream theory's application to the timeline contradictions is direct. Dreams do not track time consistently. People in dreams age and de-age between scenes. Locations in dreams change shape and content without warning. Characters in dreams have memories that contradict each other and abilities that shift from moment to moment. The contradictions inside SpongeBob in this reading are not bugs. They are the natural texture of a dream that is being recorded and broadcast to an audience. SpongeBob's first words being, quote, 22 in one episode and, quote, 23 in another is exactly the kind of detail that a dream would handle inconsistently. Patrick having a sister and not having a sister is exactly the kind of family relationship that a dream would treat as fluid. The Krusty Krab existing for 17 years in one dialogue line and for decades in another flashback is exactly the kind of temporal slippage that occurs when a dreamer tries to recall how long something has been true. The dream theory has the advantage of being elegant. It accounts for the contradictions without invoking parallel realities or post-apocalyptic mutation. It treats the show's strangeness as inherent to its nature rather than as a flaw in its construction. It also has the advantage of fitting the show's tonal register. SpongeBob has always operated on a logic closer to dream than to documentary. The physics of the world, the behavior of the characters, the way fire works underwater, the way a sponge can be stretched into impossible shapes and put back together, all of these elements are more consistent with dream rules than with any consistent set of physical laws. The disadvantage of the dream theory is that it requires the viewer to accept that the entire show is, in some sense, not real even within its own fiction. If Bikini Bottom is a dream, then the events of the show are not events. The characters are not characters. The friendships are not friendships. The decades of emotional investment that fans have built up around SpongeBob and his world are, by the logic of the theory, an investment in the contents of someone's sleeping mind. Most fans, even the ones who find the theory theory intellectually satisfying do not actually want to apply it. The price of the theory is too high. Accepting it costs the audience the reality of the show. There is a fourth, smaller theory that deserves mention, which is the unreliable narrator theory. The argument is that many of the contradictions inside the show are not contradictions in the world itself, but contradictions in the way the characters describe the world. The season 5 episode Friend or Foe, which gave the dump fight origin of the Krabby Patty, is structured around 3 different narrators telling 3 different versions of the same story. Mr. Krabs tells one version, Plankton tells a contradicting version, Karen tells what is presented as the true version, after both of the men have lied. The episode itself is built on the premise that the canon of the Krabby Patty's origin is what one of the characters says it is, and that different characters will say different things depending on what they need the audience to believe. The unreliable narrator theory, applied across the show, would suggest that many of the canonical contradictions are the result of different episodes being narrated from different characters' perspectives, with each character bending the truth to fit their own self-image. Mr. Krabs claiming the recipe was passed down from his mother in Enemy In-Law would, in this reading, be a lie Mr. Krabs told to impress his mother's new boyfriend. Squidward's flashback in Truth or Square, showing him as a happy gardener before SpongeBob arrived, would be Squidward's romanticized version of his own past, not the literal history. The Christmas references in early season 1 would be the writers showing the world as the characters remembered it, with all the small inaccuracies of human memory included. The theory has the advantage of being grounded in actual on-screen evidence, since Friend or Foe explicitly establishes that the show's characters lie about their own histories. The disadvantage of the unreliable narrator theory is that it requires the viewer to do the work of distinguishing which narrators to believe and when. The show has not provided guidance on this. Karen's account in Friend or Foe is treated as the truth, but Karen herself is a computer who could be programmed to believe almost anything. The various flashbacks across the series are not always attributed to a specific narrator. Many of them are simply shown, without commentary, as if they were objective history. The unreliable narrator theory can explain individual contradictions when the narrator is identifiable. It cannot explain contradictions where there is no clear narrator at all. There is also the position that the original creator of the show held, which is that none of these theories needed to be true, and that the contradictions did not need to be resolved. Stephen Hillenburg, in interviews across his life, expressed consistent disinterest in tracking the canon of his own series. He treated each episode as a self-contained story. He did not require the writers under him to maintain continuity across episodes. He resisted attempts to lock down character backstories, including the famous case of Pearl's mother, where he refused to allow the writers to ever explain who she was or what had happened to her. The shelved season 5 plot outline that would have answered the question was killed at his direction, and his refusal stood until the day he died. The Hillenburg position, applied to the timeline, is that the show was never meant to have a coherent timeline, that the contradictions are the natural result of a show being made by people who care about jokes more than they care about lore, and that any attempt to systematize the canon is, in some sense, a misunderstanding of what the show was for. The position has a kind of integrity. It is also, by the standards of the modern fan community, a difficult one to accept. SpongeBob has been on the air for over 25 years. Its audience has had decades to build maps of the canon, to construct family trees, to assemble timelines, to track every character's history. The audience has done this work whether the show wanted it to or not. The contradictions, once cataloged, demand explanation. The 4 theories are the explanations the fanbase has built to fill the space the show itself refused to fill. The result, by 2026, is that no single theory wins. The apocalypse theory has been partially confirmed, but has been contradicted by the show's own execution. The multiverse theory has been formally endorsed for Camp Coral, but has not been extended to the rest of the contradictions. The dream theory has elegance, but no on-screen support. The unreliable narrator theory has on-screen support, but limited reach. The Hillenburg position, which is that the show was never meant to be tracked, sits underneath all of them as a kind of ground truth that the other theories are trying to work around. What unites all 4 theories is that they each, in their own way, accept the contradictions rather than try try to deny them. They each treat the canon's instability as a feature rather than a flaw. They each acknowledge that the show is doing something stranger than a simple animated comedy can usually be expected to do. The contradictions are, in the end, not a problem to be solved. They are the texture of the world the show has built. The fan community has spent decades trying to map them, and the show has spent the same decades quietly resisting the map. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The four theories explain different parts of the contradiction, but the deepest answer to why none of it tracks is buried in the structure of cartoons themselves. In the next section, we walk through the floating timeline as Hillenburg actually meant it. Section 10. The floating timeline, the cartoon logic, and why none of it was ever meant to add up. The reason the timeline of SpongeBob SquarePants does not work in the end is the same reason the timeline of almost every long-running animated show does not work. The reason is structural. It is built into the form. It has nothing to do with bad writing, careless flashbacks, or the four theories the fan community has constructed to make sense of the contradictions. The floating timeline, the device that we walked through briefly in the first section of this video, is the actual answer. It has been the answer since 1997, when Stephen Hillenburg sat down with his initial pitch and decided that SpongeBob would never grow up. Every contradiction that has accumulated in the canon since that day has been a downstream consequence of that single decision. A floating timeline, in the formal definition that has been used by animators and comics writers for nearly a century, is a setting in which characters age little or not at all, while the world around them remains contemporary to the audience. The Wikipedia entry on the device traces its history through American comics, where Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, and the rest of the superhero pantheon have all been existing inside floating timelines for decades. Art Simpson has been 10 years old since 1989. Mickey Mouse has been roughly the same age since the 1920s. Garfield has been the same overweight orange cat since 1978. The floating timeline is not a SpongeBob invention. It is an industry standard, a structural choice that almost every commercially successful, long-running animated series has adopted at some point, because the alternative, which is real-time aging, ends shows. A character who turns 80 will eventually have to deal with retirement, illness, and death. A character who stays in his late 20s forever can have 10,000 more adventures. The choice, for any show that wants to keep producing episodes, is not really a choice at all. It is the only option. What the floating timeline does to a show's internal canon, however, is something that most analyses of the device do not fully address. The floating timeline does not just freeze the characters, it also softens the connection between events. If SpongeBob never ages, then the gap between Help Wanted and any other episode is not a real gap. SpongeBob in the pilot is the same SpongeBob in the most recent episode of the show in 2026. The intervening 27 years did not happen to him. They happened to the audience watching him. The show, in some sense, takes place in a continuous present. Every episode is the same day. Every episode is also a different day. The contradiction is not a contradiction. It is the texture of a show that has refused to commit to a calendar. This is why every contradiction we have walked through across the previous sections has been tolerated by the show without correction. SpongeBob's birth from an egg in Your Shoes Untied and his birth from a placental mother in Truth or Square are not a problem that needs to be solved, because there is no time inside the show during which SpongeBob's birth happened. He has always been alive. He will always be alive. The two flashbacks are not depicting two different versions of the same event. They are depicting the same event twice, told differently, because the show does not have an authoritative version of any event. Every event in SpongeBob's past is, in some sense, a story the show has decided to tell, rather than a fact the show has decided to record. The same logic applies to Squidward's tenure at the Krusty Krab. Whether he has been there for 17 years, or 30 years, or 50 years, is not a question the show has the structure to answer. Squidward in Help Wanted has always been there. Squidward in Truth or Square had a garden before SpongeBob arrived. Squidward in Goodbye Krabby Patty has been a cashier for 17 years. All three statements are true inside their own episodes. None of them is true across the show as a whole, because the show as a whole does not have a true. It has episodes. Each episode has its own internal logic. The connection between episodes is, in the floating timeline sense, weaker than the connection between between scenes inside an episode. The same logic applies to Patrick's sister. Whether Patrick has Sam, Squidina, both, or neither is not a question the show is structured to answer, because Patrick's family is whatever the current episode needs it to be. The "something smells Patrick" is an only child because the joke required an only child. The "big sister Sam Patrick has a sister" because the episode needed a sister. The "Patrick Star Show Patrick has Squidina" because the spin-off needed a sister. Each version of Patrick's family is functional inside its own context. The contradictions between the contexts are not contradictions inside the canon, because the canon does not commit to one context over another. The same logic applies to Christmas, to the Krabby Patty's origin, to Sandy's arrival in Bikini Bottom, to the year 4017 calendar in SB 129, and to every other timeline error we have walked through across this video. The show does not have a fixed version of any of these things, because the show is not built on the assumption that things have fixed versions. Each episode is a self-contained story. Each story has the freedom to invent the history it needs. The accumulated weight of 27 years of those inventions is a canon that is, by every measurable standard, a contradiction sandwich. But the contradictions are the natural product of the form, not an indictment of the writers. Stephen Hillenburg, in the interviews he gave across his life, was direct about this. He did not believe the show needed to track its own continuity. He resisted the attempts of his writers when they wanted to lock down character backstories, to make the canon more rigid. The most famous example was Pearl's mother. The trivia book published in 2000 by former episode writer David Fain established that Pearl was biologically Mr. Krabs' daughter, and that her mother was a whale. The line implied that there was, at some point in Mr. Krabs' life, a Mrs. Krabs. According to current showrunner Vincent Waller, Hillenburg received hundreds of fan letters over the years asking for an episode that would explain Pearl's origin. A plot outline for that episode was actually written and entered early development during season 5. Hillenburg shut it down. He told the writers that Pearl's origin was not something the show should ever explain, and the episode was shelved permanently. The Pearl decision was not a decision about Pearl. It was a decision about how the show was going to handle its own canon for the rest of its run. Hillenburg understood, even if he never said it in these exact terms, that committing to an answer about Pearl's mother would lock the show into a continuity that it did not want. The mystery was the point. Once the mystery was solved, the audience would have a fact, and the fact would limit what the show could do with the character afterward. By refusing to answer, Hillenburg kept the character open. Pearl could be anything the show needed her to be. Her mother could be any kind of whale, or no whale at all, or alive, or dead, or simply absent. The absence was the resource. The same principle, applied across the rest of the show, is the reason every other contradiction exists. The writers were not allowed to commit. Each episode was free to invent what it needed. The contradictions accumulated. The show kept going. The audience kept watching. The canon, by the time it reached its current size, was less a unified history and more a kind of living mythology, with multiple competing versions of every event, every relationship, every origin. SpongeBob was born from an egg. SpongeBob was born from a hospital delivery. Both are true. Neither is true. The show is fine. The show is not fine. The show has been running for over 25 years and is still producing new episodes and new spin-offs and new movies, and the contradictions are not slowing it down, because the contradictions are the product, not the bug. There is a useful comparison to make with another long-running animated show that handles its canon in the opposite way. The Simpsons, which premiered in 1989 and has been running for over 35 years, also operates inside a floating timeline. Bart has been 10 years old for 35 years. Lisa has been 8 years old for 35 years. Maggie has been a baby for 35 years. The Simpsons, however, has gone through a notorious series of flashback episodes that have repeatedly rewritten the family's history, with Homer and Marge meeting in different decades, depending on which episode is being treated as primary. The fan community has spent years cataloging The Simpsons' contradictions, in the same way they have cataloged SpongeBob's contradictions. The Simpsons, like SpongeBob, has refused to settle on a single canonical history. The difference between the two shows is the tone of the contradiction. The Simpsons treats its own continuity errors as a kind of background frustration, with the writers occasionally addressing them in self-aware jokes that acknowledge the impossibility of tracking the canon. SpongeBob does not do this. SpongeBob does not, except in very rare cases, acknowledge its own contradictions. things. The show acts, in each new episode, as if the canon being established in that episode is the canon. The audience, watching from outside, can see the contradictions stacking up. The show does not. The show is, in this sense, less self-aware about its own continuity than The Simpsons is, but it is also less burdened by the awareness. SpongeBob in 2026 is still telling stories with the freshness of a show that does not believe its own past constrains it. The Simpsons, by comparison, has occasionally felt weighed down by the impossibility of its own history. Hillenburg's approach was the lighter one. He wanted the show to feel like an ongoing collection of stories about a yellow sponge, rather than a serialized epic about a single character's life. The contradictions were the cost of that feeling. The benefit was that the show could keep being itself in any direction for as long as it had stories to tell. The benefit, in 2026, is still being collected. SpongeBob is still on the air. The show has produced over 320 episodes, 4 feature films, a Broadway musical, a Netflix original Plankton movie, and at least 3 spin-off series. The contradictions have grown alongside the body of work. The body of work has grown anyway. What the contradictions actually mean, when pulled back from the level of individual episodes and viewed at the scale of the entire franchise, is that SpongeBob SquarePants is not a story. It is a place. It is a collection of characters, settings, and recurring jokes that the audience can return to without needing the place to make linear sense. The pineapple is always there. The Krusty Krab is always open. SpongeBob is always going to work. Squidward is always tired. Patrick is always under his rock. The events of any given episode are real to that episode, and only loosely real to the rest of the canon. Bikini Bottom is, in this reading, less a city with a history and more a stage on which any number of stories can be performed. The stage does not need to track which stories have been performed on it before. The stage is the constant. This is, in fact, the way most enduring fictional worlds eventually come to function. The Marvel and DC Comics universes, after decades of accumulated continuity, eventually instituted formal multiverse mechanics to allow contradicting stories to coexist. Doctor Who, after 60 years on the air, treats its own continuity as flexible enough to accommodate almost any inconsistency. Star Trek, Star Wars, Pokémon, and dozens of other long-running franchises have each, in their own ways, settled into a relationship with their own canon that prioritizes the freshness of new stories over the rigidity of past ones. SpongeBob has done the same thing. The difference is that SpongeBob never made a formal announcement about it. The show simply behaved this way from the beginning, and the audience adjusted. The Mr. Lawrence confirmation in December 2024, in this context, is not a contradiction of the floating timeline approach. It is an admission that the show always had the freedom to invent its own backstory, that the original creators had once considered a specific apocalyptic backstory, and that they ultimately did not commit to it. The freedom to imagine the backstory was, in itself, the freedom that the floating timeline had granted them. They could imagine a post-apocalyptic city. They could imagine a normal city. They could imagine both, and neither, and a slightly different version every season. The audience, watching from outside, would absorb the various versions and assemble its own composite picture. The composite picture would never be canonical, because the show would never commit to any single component of it. The result, by 2026, is that SpongeBob SquarePants is a show without a fixed timeline, a fixed history, or a fixed canon, and is simultaneously one of the most internally consistent pieces of children's television ever produced. The consistency is not a consistency of facts, it is a consistency of feeling. The show feels the same in 2026 as it did in 1999, despite having changed almost every detail of its world along the way. The pineapple is the same pineapple. The Krusty Krab is the same Krusty Krab. SpongeBob is the same SpongeBob, even though he has been born twice, raised by different parents, met Sandy at 2 different ages, and worked at the Krusty Krab for either 17 years or his entire adult life, depending on the episode. The contradictions do not erode the consistency. They sit underneath it, and the consistency holds. Every timeline error in the show, when traced back to its source, ends up at the same place. The error exists because Hillenburg refused to commit. The refusal was not laziness. It was a deliberate choice, made in 1997, that the show should never become a prisoner of its own history. The choice has held through every season, every spin-off, every movie, and every era of the franchise. The contradictions are the visible signs of the choice. They are the price paid for the freedom that allowed the show to keep being itself for over 25 years. The pineapple is still there. SpongeBob is still going to work. The Krusty Krab is still open. None of the timeline errors have ever closed it. None of them ever will. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.